Good evening, dear guests of today's program and dear participants. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion. My name is Elizabeth Horst. I'm the Minister Counsel for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. I'd like to thank everyone who has made this program possible, along with my colleagues at the Embassy and the consulates and media company. My special thanks go to our guest speaker, Professor Layli Mapayan, from Wellesley College in the United States, and moderator Aisha Kamara, who joins us from Frankfurt. Ms. Kamara will introduce Professor Mapayan in more detail, but a warm welcome to you both. Black History Month is more than a ritual. It's a moment in time to reflect, to look back at the evils of racism. But Black History Month is also an opportunity to assess the challenges our societies are facing. And it's an opportunity to celebrate and to discuss what we want our societies to look like. How can we move forward to a more just society, as the title of today's discussion suggests? It's a joyous occasion where we celebrate the vibrancy and creativity of Black culture, not just in the US, but all over the world. In the United States, Black History Month is both a celebration and a reminder that Black American history is American history, that Black American culture is American culture. In the UK, they celebrate Black British history. In Canada, Black Canadian history. And here in Germany, there's also Black German history and culture that is receiving more and more attention, that's being discussed and celebrated. It's also important that we learn from one each other in this month. In explaining the idea behind the first Negro History Week, as it was called in 1926, Carter Woodson wrote, "What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of a world void of national bias, racial hatred, and religious prejudice." Woodson, a Black American scholar, launched a week-long celebration to raise awareness of the contributions of Black Americans to history. In his studies at the University of Chicago and Harvard, Woodson saw how Black people were underrepresented in the books and conversations that shaped the study of American history. African Americans were barely a part of the story. By the mid-1960s, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, the most popular textbook for 8th grade US history classes mentioned only 2 Black people in this entire history that had transpired since the Civil War. In 1964, the author James Baldwin reflected on the shortcomings of his education. "When I was going to school," he said, "I began to be bugged by the teaching of American history because it seemed that history had been taught without cognizance of my presence." So representation matters. Seeing ourselves and our neighbors and our friends really matters. And that's why Baldwin's thoughts echoed through many of those before him and after him. And 50 years after Carter Woodson and his colleagues launched Black History Week, the week then became a month. And since 1976, every US president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. The forces that drove Carter Woodson nearly a century ago are just as relevant as they were then, almost 100 years ago. In the United States, we're still having debates over how racial history and the existence of systemic racism should be taught in schools. And frankly, it's troubling to see that some school boards are banning books that they say make our children feel uncomfortable. Some states have passed laws that restrict how teachers can talk about the history of race or the Holocaust in their classrooms. This is all unfortunate because I said representation matters, and knowing Black history is knowing American history. In his official decree proclaiming Black History Month, President Biden directly addressed these issues. The proclamation reads, "Black stories are essential to the ongoing story of America, our faults, our struggles, our progress, and our aspirations. Shining a light on Black history today is as important as understanding ourselves and growing stronger as a nation as there's ever been. It is why it is essential that we take time to celebrate the immeasurable contributions of Black Americans, honor the legacies and achievements of generations past, reckon with centuries of injustice, and confront those injustices that still fester today. An essential part of that commitment is building a federal government that looks like America, diverse and vibrant. And that's also a priority at our embassy here in Berlin and our 5 consulates around Germany." President Biden ended his proclamation with an excerpt from the poem that Amanda Gorman wrote and recited at the inauguration a year ago. Listen to the words of this amazingly talented young poet. "Being American is more than the pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. A country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. Black History Month is an opportunity to reimagine what possibilities lie ahead." I am looking forward to the vibrant discussion this afternoon or tonight about how we can build true cultures of inclusion. Thank you, and over to you, Aisha.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth Horst. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining tonight. My name is Aisha, and I'm really happy to be moderating tonight. Another thank you goes to Elizabeth. Thank you for your welcoming words. Thank you also to the team of the US Embassy in Berlin for putting this event together, and Technic team is also doing such a great job. In these challenging pandemic times, it is really important for us to still be able to exchange and connect digitally. So we are using the platform Slido. And before I introduce our speaker, and then before we be able to hear the keynote, let's start off by using this platform that you can use, the audience can use it to ask questions after the keynote. So let's just start off with the icebreaker question so you can get to know the platform. So as Elizabeth was mentioning, the context of tonight is, of course, Black History Month. So our first question to you would be, what do you associate with Black History Month? One word answers only. Oh, I'm sorry. I was switching screens here. It's not that easy to have my moderation card. So before we start with that Black History Month icebreaker question, we want to know where you are joining us from today. And I see Germany. More specific, people are giving the cities, but we even have guests here from Tunisia. But I feel as if most people are joining us from Berlin tonight. Okay, thank you. So I see the word cloud's gone, but we've seen that we have people joining us from everywhere in Germany. And now, no more cities. So I'm already confusing you a bit. So I need you to concentrate. This was a trick to find out if you guys are listening. So now, no more cities. We rather want you to tell us what you associate with Black History Month in one word. So power, equality, anti-discrimination, MLK, Martin Luther King, Africans, speeches, progress, confrontation, literature, pride. I'm sure that was not an easy question to just put what you associate with Black History Month in one word, but lots of people are saying awareness, lots of people are saying equality, Black Lives Matter. And that, I think, kind of brings us to the core of tonight's event, because on one hand, we see these big, I would say, positive words, awareness, equality. And on the other hand, we see words like struggle, slavery, maybe violence. And I think that brings us right into crossing bridges between the different perspectives. So thank you so much for hitting this icebreaker question with us. And let's start right into this evening. Black History Month, as Elizabeth mentioned, is a perfect occasion to reflect and celebrate the achievements made by Black people all over the world. Doing that, in Germany especially, we tend to focus on what divides us rather than on what connects us. We tend to emphasize the struggle because historically we have learned that as women, as Black people, as working class people, as people with disabilities, in order to live in a more inclusive society, We have to argue, be opponents, make demands, ask questions. What is wrong with the system? Who is not here? This evening is not so much about opposition, it is about building bridges. It is about focusing what connects us politically and spiritually. It's about love, and I guess we have chosen the right date for this. So it's an honor for me to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Leili Mapayan, who is a professor and chair of the Africana Studies Department at Wellesley College, where she is also leading the Wellesley Center for Women as a director. Leili was born into an interracial Baha'i family. She went to an historically Black university, Spelman College, and her interest in race and racism, as well as the solution of racial issues, has been lifelong. Therefore, she has been working, publishing, and thinking extensively on topics such as racial identity, Black LGBTQ+ studies, and the history of Black psychology. She also wrote 2 groundbreaking books on the concept of womanism, The Womanist Reader and The Womanist Idea, which focus on Black women's perspectives about social and ecological change. In the past year, she has presented numerous workshops on race, race amity, and racial justice inside and outside academia. She was here in Germany in 2015. She visited here also at the invitation of the US Embassy in Berlin, also in Black History Month. So maybe we can reflect a bit on what has changed since 7 years. But first of all, let me say welcome, Leili, and we are so excited to hear your keynote.
Thank you so much, Aisha. It's wonderful to be back again. And thanks for letting everyone know that I was here in 2015, is because I actually wanted to make reference to that in my presentation and get us started thinking about what has changed before we jump into some ideas about the particular methodologies that we use. So we can go ahead and put up my slide presentation. I'm happy to get started. I also, of course, want to thank Elizabeth for her wonderful introduction. And also I want to thank Martina Cole for issuing the invitation to come back and present for the US Embassy Berlin, even though now we're doing it virtually. So again, our topic today is learning from Black history about building bridges across race, ethnicity, and religion. But specifically, we're going to talk about a methodology that is cultivating social change leadership and look at some people who have done that. But before we do that, I'd like to just carry us back to when I was here before. Next slide, please. When I was here before, there were some parallels in terms of what was going on in the United States and in Germany, insofar as we were both dealing with issues of violence in our communities that were causing both fear and uprising in our respective nations. In the United States, we were fresh on the heels of the police killings of both Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and also Tamir Rice, a very young person. And in Europe, days before I had come, the mass murder had taken place at the Charlie Hebdo headquarters. So that gives you a sense of what the world was feeling like when I was here in 2015. But let's jump ahead now and think about some of the things that have changed. Next slide, please. One of the things that has really happened is that the Black Lives Matter protests and movement and the movement for racial justice that became very nationalized around the time that I was here before became internationalized as a result of the terrible murder of George Floyd that happened in May of 2020. That actually opened the eyes of people around the world that the struggle for Black dignity and for racial justice is indeed a global struggle. But that's not the only thing that was happening. Let's take a look at something else that was also happening. Next slide, please. We also know that over that time, we've had a lot of refugee crises. This photo depicts the Syrian refugee crisis and people moving, as you well know, from Syria to other parts of the world. Many, many refugees came to Germany. Other nations of the world either accepted or rejected these refugees. And we know that the ethnicities and nationalities that refugees bring with them in the locations where they land often function very much like race. So as we talk about ending racism, we're talking about ending many different isms. But before we can do that, we need to look more deeply at some of the polarization that has entered our society more broadly. We have to ask ourselves whether these things that we're looking at, these kinds of conflicts, are they a result of this global political polarization that's only increasing, or are they an artifact of it? We know that there's just over the last several years, there's grown to be greater polarization between right and left, between authoritarian and democratic regimes, in certain parts of the world between evangelical and secular communities, as well as other kinds of just splits that people are deepening. And these are beginning to affect our societies on such a deep level that it's becoming harder and harder to get into the same conversation. Yet with presentations like the one that I'm doing today and with the series that the embassy has been holding, part of the goal is to get us back into conversation. Another thing that has happened over the last several years is that intersectionality has become more mainstream. This is a concept that emerged in feminist discourse in the 1970s and early 1980s, but it's now something that people are talking more about more broadly. As many of you know, feminist thinker Audre Lorde, the late Audre Lorde, who of course has visited Germany, she said that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I think it's really obvious that you can't talk about racism, for example, without also talking about gender or about religion or about sexual orientation or about nationality or ability status. All of these things are constantly interacting, constantly shaping each other. And so we have to have an awareness that multiple identities are intersecting and that our political movements and our social change actions have to take that into account. Next slide, please. One of the things that's notable about the United States and Germany is that we have certain shared histories or certain attributes that characterize both of our societies. We've both experienced state violence related to race, ethnicity, and religion. We've both experienced a history of collective racist traumas or related collective traumas for the minority groups in our midst. We've both experienced shifting hostilities. One day it's race, another day it's ethnicity, another day it's religion, another day it's immigration status, et cetera. We've both experienced hate groups, hate movements, and hate crimes. We've had immigration controversies. We have colonial legacies that we're still dealing with, as well as enduring neo-colonial relationships. We also both have narratives that never again will some terrible things happen, even though we sometimes see inklings of these things reemerging. We also have both had feminist and womanist movements that have provided important perspectives, such as intersectionality, which I just mentioned. And we've also had notable efforts at social transformation and national healing. These are things that make us able to be into conversation together about how to make change towards this better world that we all envision. Next slide, please. So here are the questions that we're really considering. These are the bigger issue questions. How do we move through these kinds of impasses that come from these socially different groups working through power relations, collective traumas, and other things? What is the methodology by which we do that? And importantly, for today's lecture, how can we learn from Black history specifically? I'd like to introduce the concept of social change leadership, which is, from my perspective, a methodology by which we can make change starting from where we are. Social change leadership is simply using one's agency and voice to make a positive difference in the world, starting wherever one finds oneself. This is actually sort of a core idea in the Black social change methodology, that you start where you are with who you have and what you have to change what needs to be changed. So everyone can be a protagonist in this process. The first thing is simply to see yourself as a protagonist and recognize that you have power to make change, no matter where you are in the system. The next step is to start it, just to start somewhere to do something to make a difference. And the next thing is to spread it by connecting with others and moving the change through your networks, mobilizing people who share the need for change or share ideas about how to do it, or simply the willingness to move things. As we do this, critical mass builds as networks of protagonists organically create and sustain a new pattern of life characterized by justice, peace, unity, amity, love, and genuine material and spiritual prosperity for all. So obviously, if we think deeply about it, the world that we live in now, that we see as characterized by all of this conflict and all of this opposition and different groups that, experience violence and so on, is a pattern of life. If we want to overwrite it, we have to create a new pattern of life. And a pattern of life is created by all of our actions put together. So even the smallest things that we think don't make a big difference actually do, which is why starting somewhere, starting anywhere is important, but then continuing to work along those lines with others is so important. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight the work of someone who's exercised social change leadership inside academia and someone whose frame informs the view that I want to offer today. And that person is historian Dr. Richard W. Thomas, who pioneered this notion of the other tradition, which refers to the long history of interracial collaboration, cooperation, and community against the backdrop of a racist social norm. So in US history in particular, which we know goes back over 400 years, when we understand that racism may be the social dominant of what we see, that doesn't mean that there isn't also this other important alternate history of people working together interracially, whether just naturally because they're not thinking about race or because they are consciously trying to override the racist norm. So examples of these kinds of things in this other tradition, and that's the very word that Richard Thomas uses, is things like interracial settlements, towns, and experimental communities where people tried to live together in racial harmony. We also think about interracial societies and organizations, including many of those activist organizations that started, for example, in the 1960s, and many of those which have arisen, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. And also noteworthy are interracial friendships and collaborations that led to positive change. Now, if you want more information about this other tradition, the book that Richard Thomas published is one source. Here's another podcast and a documentary that also talk about it. I turn you to those sources if you'd like to go deeper into this, but I think you get the main idea that there is this other tradition of interracial collaboration and harmony that we should look at and we should learn from. Next slide, please. So thinking about how to see this is important because we're blasted with so much information about the existence of racism and about how racism is so embedded in our society that it can make it hard to see anything else. But we have to actually go out of our way to look for and document instances of friendship, cooperation, allyship, and trust among people who belong to historically opposed groups. And this is evidence of this other tradition. Often it's most visible in everyday acts and places, and it's easiest to access through personal stories, narratives, and biographies. And potentially, as I already mentioned, this other tradition can organically evolve into a new pattern of life that overwrites the older, more conflictual model of society and community that's rooted in a focus on racism. Next slide, please. So I want to pause as we're talking about the other tradition to say a word about the importance of both sacred and secular contributions to our discourse and to our thinking about racial reconciliation, about healing, and about ending the various kinds of isms and forms of hate and violence that are related to group membership. The world's faiths and wisdom traditions offer at least as much counsel for amity as they do for conflict. We know that if we look into sacred texts, we can see stories and examples about both things. But it is important to mine our sacred traditions for counsel about amity and about all these things that we're seeking, and to actively draw upon this to shift dialogues and help create common ground. This is important not just because of what is there, but because so many people are so strongly affiliated with religious traditions that if we ignore them, then we risk alienating many people from the conversation. But it's also important to note secularism is one antidote. Religious wisdom also can offer another, and sacred and secular discourses both have to have a place in our conversation. And we'll see that in the examples that I'll be highlighting in moments. At this point, I want to shift to just giving a few quick examples of social change leadership in action by individuals who I would say fall into what we're calling this other tradition. Next slide, please. And these are not in chronological order or any particular order, but just to be like a flurry of examples. So I start here with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, because these are two figures that many people associate with Black history in the United States. For example, when we had the word cloud, MLK came up. He's just someone that people associate with Black history. If you know anything, though, about the viewpoints of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, you know that there was a time when they had very different approaches to thinking about how to achieve racial justice. One was considered more integrationist, the other was considered more of a separatist. But as one historian has noted, they were fundamentally spiritual men. While we remember them for their social and political activism, they were religious and spiritual at their core. And in the last years of their lives, they were starting to move toward one another. So finding a common core despite difference is one of the methods that these social change leaders use. Next slide, please. Again, we look to Martin Luther King, who had an important relationship with Bayard Rustin, a gay man and a Quaker, also an African-American, who brought the social movement strategy of nonviolence, or ahimsa, which we associate with Gandhi, to Martin Luther King Jr. And he was, in fact, the architect of the famous 1963 March on Washington. And so we see here, even though the relationship wasn't always easy, we see the collaboration between two African-American men, one straight, one gay, working together for racial justice and to move the needle on racial change. Next slide, please. Friendship has played an outsized role in moving racial justice politically, because often political actors from different spheres exchange information through friendship. So friendship is an important methodology not to be overlooked because it's informal and because it's personal. One classic example of a famous interracial influential friendship was between First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression. And she described educator Mary McLeod Bethune as a dear friend. Together, they worked to advance interracial initiatives in civic and governmental arenas. And so that relationship brought interracial work to the highest levels of government. And it just goes to show the importance of friendship. Next slide, please. Another relationship that falls somewhat into the category of a friendship was between Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald. Marilyn Monroe used her fame and media allure to secure a week-long engagement at the segregated Macombo nightclub in Hollywood for Ella Fitzgerald, which changed the course of Ella Fitzgerald's career. And it was the friendship and trust between these women that allowed this to happen, because sometimes people are skeptical of receiving gifts or help from people of different racial groups, but sometimes that exchange is key to making movement that is larger than the two individuals concerned. Next slide, please. This story is very interesting. In the 1960s, a civil rights worker by the name of Zernona Clayton befriended the head of the largest racist organization in the United States, Calvin Craig, who was a Grand Dragon, which is the name for the leaders in the Ku Klux Klan. And using their shared declared Baptist faith for leverage, she persuaded him over time to leave and denounce the Klan in favor of racial amity. And there's a wonderful play that was written about this relationship. There are a lot of articles you can find. It's fascinating. It took a tremendous amount of courage, which is why I label this methodology taking a risk. It took tremendous amount of courage to imagine that a friendship could occur between someone who was an African-American civil rights leader and the leader of a racist organization. But it just goes to show the power of positive interpersonal interactions in changing the hearts of people in a good direction, not to be overstated. All right, so another interesting example of cross-collaboration comes from Liberia, West Africa, a country where I've done a lot of work. During the Liberian Civil War, Christian social worker Lima Bowie, which you may know because she later won the Nobel Peace Prize, invited Muslim police officer Asatu Ba Kenneth to help her form Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, which ultimately ended the war. This is a picture of the women who were in the group Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. And it was because they crossed the bridge, they brought two distinct communities together, that they were able to form a larger mass that applied the power of gender, women, and motherhood to shift the dynamics of the very terrible civil war in Liberia. Next slide. A good colleague of mine, Hawa Ibrahim, a jurist from northern Nigeria, has talked about the what she calls the soft power of motherhood to reduce fundamentalism and to eliminate various forms of violence in society. And there's a very interesting story about her own work, how she helped secure the release of a number of the girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram. Because she is a member of the same ethnic and linguistic group that the members of Boko Haram came from, she was able to go to the village, talk to the mothers of the guys who are in Boko Haram, get the mothers to bring the sons to account, and through that process, get them to locate and release many of the girls. So this idea that is endemic in many African cultures, including African American, about the power of women, the power of mothers, and the power of motherhood should not be underestimated in our social change efforts and in our social change leadership actions. Next slide, please. It's also how we walk into a room. We know that throughout Black history, the ability to showcase and demonstrate Black nobility has been a force for change. And Louis G. Gregory, a lawyer from South Carolina, committed his life to promoting racial amity after joining the Baha'i Faith in 1909. He traveled throughout the segregated South to spread the message of racial unity. He also traveled nationally and internationally to spread this message. And part of his success was how he showed up and showed Black nobility to the world. Although it should be implicit in being, often racism makes it something that people don't take for granted. So there's something about the strategy of showcasing human nobility that is important for us to look at in our understanding of social change leadership. Next slide, please. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows about Audre Lorde, a self-described Black feminist, lesbian poet, mother warrior who visited Germany to find common cause with her Afro-German sisters and help mobilize a movement for self-naming and recognition, as well as feminist cross-racial collaboration. And I know that the embassy had a program featuring Audre Lorde recently, so I won't say much more about it, except to turn your attention to a new book by another one of my colleagues called In Audre's Footsteps. So if you're a fan of Audre Lorde and particularly her work in Germany, you might be interested in this new book by Heidi Renee Lewis. Next slide, please. So the last example that I just want to point out is the example of Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, who are the founders of Black Lives Matter. And if you read their official statements about their intentions for this movement and this loose organization of activists, it is to bring people from margin to center, so that even within Black activism and even within Black community, making sure that women, feminists, queer people, trans people, et cetera, are at the center of the discourse. It's a radically inclusive strategy of enlarging who's at the table and making sure that there's universal participation and more voices involved in a large social change movement. Next slide, please. So now let's just quickly distill the methodology and think about what we're going to take away as we reflect on becoming social change leaders ourselves. Next slide, please. First of all, we have to think beyond racism and anti-racism. All of these stories that we just heard reflect something that forces us to look beyond racism and anti-racism towards an alternative view on human relationships, society, and difference. Rather than normalizing an oppositional view, which is what the racist discourse or racism discourse invites us to do, these other perspectives invite us to consider a view with its roots in unity and amity. And rather than negating the obvious reality of collective racist trauma and other forms of group trauma and similar historical wrongs, these views teach us to focus on healing rather than fighting and loving rather than winning. Because they weaken rather than strengthen the barriers that we associate with difference, they create opportunities to dissolve antipathy and break down the social and emotional walls that separate individuals and groups. So I want to introduce this concept of an invitational perspective. We're all familiar with the politics of opposition, the idea of us versus them, with all its warlike metaphors like the struggle and the battle against this and that, and we're going to win. And if you're not for us, you're against us. This is a completely different view, which focuses on starting point of us as a we, as a family. The idea that we invite you to join us as we move towards this better world. Let's move together. You can start wherever you are. If we build it, they will come. This is a different perspective that we should carry with us as we invite others to participate in our social leadership, social change leadership journeys. Next slide, please. Constructive resilience is another concept. And while I won't read all of this in the interest of time, constructive resilience is an idea about how to step into the social change equation without taking on the characteristics of the oppressor. It's a way of standing in with patience, calm, contentment, et cetera, and bringing good qualities, the qualities that we wish to see into the world, into our transaction, even with hostile others. So in the end, constructive resilience resilience allows us to transform conditions of ignorance and prejudice and win the respect and collaboration of fair-minded people in our midst, which has historically been an important strategy as part of the Black community, but many other communities worldwide as well. Next slide, please. So we have new possibilities for culture and identity. One is just to acknowledge that in addition to all of our cultures, all of our group identities, that a global trans culture is emerging, which is one that allows us to have planetary identity and to identify with the whole human race at the same time as we retain and recognize our diverse and intersectional group memberships. Next slide, please. So now just to summarize and conclude, people of African descent worldwide, past and present, have provided all of us with illuminating examples of social change leadership and praxis. Examining how Black people think about and engage in the work of social transformation adds a great deal to our universal social change toolkit, methods that enlarge the circle of inclusion, invite more people to the table, listen to women and other marginalized groups, seek harmony and collaboration, make it possible for everyday people to participate, and engage the spiritual dimension of life are reflective of Africana-centered approaches. And these are now a gift to all humanity and the people of all nations. So I will conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Layli, for this amazing presentation. And as I introduced you, I was talking about that shift. So your concept, or the concept you just presented, you have to kind of change your mindset and completely shift your focus. So my first question would be, you as having experienced, I'm relatively sure, racism, sexism, how did you make it to that shifting point, and how does your spirit, because you talked about Martin Luther King being a spiritual man, so how does the Baha'i religion come into play in this shift?
I think for many people of faith, myself included, that there's something in religion that offers the notion that at our root, we all have something in common, and that is our spiritual selves. And in that sense, we're all equal from the outset. And so the kind of disunity that we see, the violence, the conflict, the hatred, the one up, one down, kind of mindset, we understand it to be appearance and not reality. We understand it as something that is a problem that needs to be nurtured in another direction. And I would say that in particular, in the Baha'i faith, we start the assumption that we are a global we are a global family, that humanity is at its root, is one. But the idea is that because of, a variety of things that have happened historically and otherwise, we have a lot of healing work to do. So the approach is more about how can I heal this situation? And what does healing take? Healing takes the involvement of the heart. It takes a relational approach. It takes bringing certain kinds of emotional attributes and behaviors that elevate all concerned. And so sticking to that approach, I think, is, something that I've tried to practice in my life, obviously imperfectly, because sometimes things happen that are just incredibly infuriating or that are terrible and scary or hurtful that we have to deal with. But, if we keep bringing ourselves back to the principle that we are a we, and that we find a way to find connection, we get there. I think there's not a day that goes by that I don't try to challenge myself to find a way to connect with everyone around me, even the people that I think I don't feel connected to. And it usually works.
Thank you so much. Very inspiring. Even though I have lots and lots of more questions that I would like to ask you, we have the audience already putting in lots of questions, and you can still put your questions in. So I will give you a first question from Julia Fracek. She's a book blogger, and her question is, she asked if you could name a book that teaches young people about Black history and the issues Black people still have to face today. What's your favorite book? There's another question also asking for book tips. So maybe you can name one book. I know you mentioned the Audre Lorde book, but maybe another book that you'd like to read and recommend.
Yeah, there are so many good books now. And, often I find myself turning to really old books. For example, there's a historical encyclopedia series that came out for young readers in the 1960s. And I have one volume of it called Profiles in Negro Womanhood. And even though it's a really old book that uses language that we don't use anymore, it's an incredible set of short, readable stories about figures from Black history, some of whom are very famous and some of whom most people have never heard of. But it tells each of their stories in a way that makes you recognize the richness of Black history. But of course, so many people, I'm not an expert on young adult literature, but so many people have put out good biographies of Black history figures, as well as books that talk about ideas. So, there's a lot out there to choose from.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And since you mentioned the 60s, our next question hits right on spot because Gregor is interested in the impact of the 1960s civil rights movement marches for today's society, legally and socially.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very interesting question, because the way I like to think of the civil rights movement is as one chapter in what we sometimes refer to as the much longer Black social movement. The Black social movement has been going on in the United States since the founding of the country, and in fact, even before that, because just as long as Black people were brought from Africa to the Caribbean and the United States and were put into a position of servitude and slavery, there has been, reaction and rebellion to that state, and there's been the pursuit of freedom, of dignity, of the ability to live out one's life as one sees fit. And so the Black social movement is much longer, and the civil rights movement is only one chapter. And as with all chapters of this movement, there are successes and then there's backlash. There's successes and then there's backlash. And so we could say, for example, that the Black Lives Matter movement now is a resurgence of that same movement that was called the civil rights movement in the 60s. And so it is ongoing, and until we fully achieve justice, it will be ongoing.
Thank you so much for that insight. Another question from Ruth. She asked, why Black History Month? I think we kind of answered that question, so maybe we'll focus on part 2. What has it achieved so far?
Okay. Black history has achieved a lot because, for one thing, it has affected higher education. From those early efforts of Carter G. Woodson just to, create a Black History Week within the Black community, it has spread to institutions of learning, both higher education and K-12 education, so that now there's virtually no subject matter that you can study without some discussion of Black people who are participating, or information about Black people, or the inclusion of Black perspectives. All three of those are important. And so it has definitely influenced the curricula, but it's also contributed to the larger racial justice movements for inclusion and for equity society-wide, by sort of putting in people's face that, this thing is important, and, here are the people that we need to include and think about.
Thank you. So there's a bit of a general question. So maybe if you want to feel free, and if you have more questions, don't hesitate to just type them in. There is a question on why, in your opinion, racism is still prevailing. Okay,
that's a both complex and straightforward question. Racism still prevails because we're not taking the enough of the actions that would eradicate it. Think, for example, of all of the things in our society that remind us of racism every day. For example, every time you watch a program on television and you see groups of people that are all one race, that is psychologically reminding us about racism, where it's reinforcing the idea that people are separate. We have to both take action in terms of social change leadership and do things in the world around us to change how we relate, but we also have to show ourselves doing it in the media and in those things where people's thought is formed. So that's one of the main reasons.
Thank you so much for just putting this together really in a couple of sentences. Laura who works with young leaders in Germany, thanks you. And then she asked, how can someone who does not identify as Black, or we can even extend this maybe to other groups, become a supportive ally to their Black friends and colleagues?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I and many other people of African descent say is that there are two big things you can do. One is listen to Black people, and the other is talk with people of your same background about racial issues from an allyship perspective. So for example, let's say you're white. You would be listened to by your white friends, family, and colleagues, probably more than a Black person if those people are expressing racism. So if you go learn, you listen to Black people, you learn, you become an ally, one of the best things you can do is carry that back to the white community. So whatever your community is, changing your community is one of the most supportive things you can do for Black people.
Stefan is asking, by the way, Elizabeth has posted the panel discussion on Audre Lorde, the US Embassy organized. So please copy the link for later on, because I think the stream might be gone and that link might be gone also. And Stefan is saying, talking of healing as part of social change, how can you heal people like Donald Trump?
Mm-hmm. I think that the way to heal anyone is through personal connection and being able to see the highest and best in that person and use that as an anchor for leaning into a relationship of growth. You know, when Donald Trump was president, I used to think to myself, if I had to have a conversation with him and I wanted to try to change how we think, what would I latch onto? And one of the things that I noticed about him is that he really loved his family. And I think everybody can really relate to love of family. He loved his kids and, he loved his family and he cared deeply about them. And that's a kind of thing that almost anyone can connect to another person about. So the idea is that you always look for that inroad with the person where you can genuinely relate and where you see a genuine, kernel of goodness and you build on that. I think that's how you start in the most difficult cases.
Thank you so much for that little Trump analysis as well. Someone asked, in what parts of everyday life do minorities face racism?
Well, I would say pretty much it can occur in every moment of every day, but it depends on your circumstances. I think a lot of people try to craft their lives in a way that they carve out a safe space and they carve out a place that's very affirming of who they are. But let me give an example of how deeply embedded racism can be. I was having a conversation with someone about office space and about whether office space contributes to people of diverse backgrounds feeling comfortable in the workplace and wanting to work there. And recognizing that cultures can digress widely in terms of the ideas about what a comfortable, beautiful space is. Most offices reflect one culture's views of beauty, efficiency, et cetera. But if you have an office space that doesn't reflect the aesthetic and social views of all of the different kinds of groups there, then it's essentially a racist space. And you might think, oh, buildings can't be racist, but actually, because of the psychological effects of space on people's daily lives, they can. So, think about that. I think about, for example, when I travel to West Africa, all the billboards have Black people on them. Here in the United States, most of them have white people on them. And I think, oh, how cool it is to be in a place where everybody on the billboard is Black, and so you think those things don't make a difference, but they do. So racism is there all day, and you just have to find your ways of being okay and waking up every day to continue doing something about it, because it's everywhere all the time.
Thank you so much. How do you include people who don't want to be included? Tim asks.
Yeah, again, it has to be through personal relationships. You can't cold call people who don't want to be there, but it is possible to find ways to build relationships with people and make them want to be part of it. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes intentionality, it takes patience, perseverance, sometimes even dealing with frustration. But if you genuinely want to be inclusive, you have to make personal connections with people.
Thank you. And here's a question regarding the current situation in the US. I have to bring my phone a little bit closer because it's longer. How concerned are you with the recent movement in the US to restrict the freedoms of non-white males? For example, voting rights, attempting to ban books that make white people uncomfortable with the US history, and other uncomfortable topics like Holocaust. And thirdly, the recent Texas abortion ban. So, okay, that's a lot of questions, but
okay. Well, I would say that I'm extremely uncomfortable with those kind of moves because they're all dehumanizing moves. They're all classic racist moves. And I'm extremely concerned with them. So the question isn't, am I concerned? The question is, what do I think we can do about them? And I think, for example, throughout Black history, we find a lot of what you call DIY activism, do it yourself. So one example that I didn't share in my list of examples today that I would have loved to was the example of Milla Granston, who was a slave who had a little cabin, a slave African person, and she had a little cabin. She learned to read because the son of her slave master taught her. And then she had a little midnight school in her house where she taught other enslaved people to read. And she would take them 12 at a time. And as soon as they learned to read, she would release them and take 12 more. She did this for years and years and years and years until she taught hundreds of people to read, even though it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read. All right. That's an example of do-it-yourself activism. The school may ban the books. You can have the book club in your house. You can't let the system get the better of you. Sure, you want to use voting and all those kind of slow mechanisms to change things. You want to, write to your legislators, change the law, et cetera. But what you do in your own house with your own networks is a big part of how things change. Think about, for example, with the feminist movement, 1970s, and all the consciousness raising groups that took place right in people's living rooms, right in people's kitchens. Those things made a difference in how the larger culture thought and shifted norms in a generation. So we have to understand, again, social change leadership, what we can do from where we are with what we have.
Thank you so much. Question from Martina. It seems to me that your ideas and those of Ibram X. Kendi, so anti-racism, are opposed in that you focus on the common humanity and he focuses more on how race separates us. Is there still a dialogue between these movements? Maybe you could also explain a bit more.
Yes, race is like a double-edged thing. On the one hand, it is a fiction. And on the other hand, it is real because it's real in its effects. So I can just as easily argue that race is not real because we're one human race, we're one species, and we're all, part of one human family. And then I can turn around and say race is real for reasons of culture, for reasons of historical, discrimination, et cetera. Both things are true at the same time. So there really isn't any daylight. It's just a matter of which argument you need to make at any particular given time about the nature of race.
Thank you. To what extent is capitalism responsible for the ever-growing polarization in US society, also in Germany, I think, and by extension also to extremism and racism?
I think that there's one aspect of capitalism that's very dangerous to human beings. And that is the aspect that is willing to turn human beings into exploitable commodities. You can't build a good society for human beings holding the view that human beings can also be exploitable commodities. That's not to say that it's not okay for human beings to amass wealth or to engage in business. I'm not saying that. But the view that it's okay to turn human beings into exploitable commodities is where capitalism falls short and contributes to all those problems that you just mentioned.
Thank you again. I have to bring my phone a bit closer. If a world culture was founded, wouldn't there be the problem that this world culture would be more white and European as a world culture? The countries which are industrialized would be the biggest contributors to the world culture, which would probably destroy many local native cultures. Do you agree with this scenario?
Not exactly. First of all, there already is a world culture and there already always has been. But what's different about it is that the ability from people all over the world to communicate easily has changed because of the internet, the World Wide Web, et cetera. We have the ability to be aware of each other without travel. That's new in human history. But at the same time, all of our communication forms are influenced by who's in charge of them. And it is true that the industrialized Western countries, to some extent, have kind of a hold on the means of communication. But we have to remember, people are starting to use this phrase. Instead of saying people of color, they're starting to say people of the global majority, because the majority of the people in the world, from a demographic perspective, are not white. And if you even think about China as a technologically developed country, it's not a white country. And so, we're in a period of human history right now where people are trying to sort out who's going to be the boss, and other people are trying to sort out how we can all be in it together. And so I'm on that side of let's figure out how to all be in it together. Sure, we're going to have to work out some things about cultural dominance and overriding local cultures that are still problematic. But we can work those things out. We can move towards a more egalitarian mode that reflects the beautiful diversity of the people on this planet and their rich cultures.
Thank you so much for this Q&A, because the questions keep coming in and you just answering them all so well. And that's really, I think everyone else is really inspired in the room. I don't have the connection to you as an audience, but I'm really hoping you're enjoying this as much as I do. So maybe last question before we wrap this up. And maybe it is a nice question that brings us back into that spiritual parts of what you were saying. Is the methodology you introduced related to mindfulness? Because the wellness industry and all these subjects come, you have to be mindful, you have to do yoga. Is that connected or?
One of the things that I've talked about extensively in my own scholarly work on womanism is the great diversity of spiritual paths and how each of them is valuable. The idea is that the world has so many long and strong spiritual traditions, mindfulness being one of them, that contribute to our ability to be more and do better than we've done so far. And, one of the beautiful things about our global communication culture and about things like the internet is that now more people can get information about more different spiritual systems, and people can pursue their curiosity about different spiritual traditions, which in turn informs everyone and gives everyone the opportunity to cultivate their spiritual lives and contribute that back to humanity. So I think that's another part of the other tradition that has yet to be explored, which is the way in which our ability to be spiritually diverse, to study other traditions and get to know people from around the world is going to contribute to the building of the kind of interracial harmony and racial justice that we're really looking for.
Thank you so much. And looking at the time, we do have 3 more minutes, and there is one more question that maybe I do want to bring in because it's being broadly discussed also in Germany. Mm-hmm. What is your take on reparations? Could they improve racial justice in the US?
I think that I'm still kind of evolving my view on reparations, and I'm actually in a study group right now that's looking at it together. But my own view is that there is healing work that is needed, and reparations can be part of that. They are necessary but not sufficient, and it also depends on how you define them. If you define them as just handing people a check, I don't think that's going to change much. But if you think about it in terms of a larger process of making repair of a terrible collective wound that took place and having an honest, heartfelt conversation in which change takes place on both sides, then yes, I think it will have great effect.
Thank you. And I think we are at the end of our program today. A very good and recommendable German book. It's called in German, Was weiße Menschen nicht über Rassismus hören wollen, aber wissen sollten. And in English, that means what white people need to know about racism, don't want to hear about racism, but should hear.
Okay, it sounds like a great book. I want to thank you also, Aisha, for being such a wonderful moderator, and I've enjoyed our conversation together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience, because my job was really, really easy tonight, because you have really made it easy because you gave in lots and lots of questions. So the questions I prepared will maybe be for another conversation me and you will have.
I hope so.
Me too. So we want to end our night with asking you again, using that little Slido to interact with us. Has this program inspired you? Is what we want to know before we say goodbye. So just take a couple of minutes, seconds to think about whether this program inspired you. I know I'm really inspired, and I told you this from our first conversation we had, that just really made me shift a bit, because as being part also of the social movement here in Germany, trying to work on anti-racism and topics like this, I needed that reminder actually to focus on the other tradition. So I think it's really something we have to constantly remind each other of, because society reminds of being opponents so much. So that really inspired me. And I grabbed bell hooks and read all about love over the weekend too. So that was really inspiring as well.
Thank you. Yeah, those are some great ideas. We have to stay inspired or we can't do this work. It takes inspiration to go through the hardship. But, you know, the best things in life aren't easy. They're just worthwhile.
And I think, having said that, we all wish you a happy Valentine's Day. And keep your focus on what connects us.
Thank you.